He buried her under the rocks. Then he went home. And nobody asked him a single question for 61 years. She was 12 years old, walking home through a quiet neighborhood on a Sunday evening. She never arrived. They found her 4 days later, buried under rocks, branches, and dirt on a wooded hillside. Her mouth had been packed with soil and twigs. The man who put her there went home that same night. He drove the same roads the next morning. And the morning after that. He lived in the same city, less than 5 miles from where he had left her, for another 40 years. He attended community events. He watched his grandchildren grow up. He died peacefully in 2004 and was buried with military honors. His obituary ran in the local newspaper. Nobody connected his name to what happened on that hillside. Nobody ever asked him a single question. Not in 1964. Not in 1974. Not in 1984 or 1994. Not once in 61 years. And there is one detail in this case, one thing police discovered about this man's history that was known to local law enforcement, that makes all of that silence more disturbing than anything else in this story. We will get to it. Stay with me. This is the story of 12-year-old Mary Teresa Simpson of Elmira, New York, and of the 61-year silence that followed her death on the evening of March 15, 1964. It is the story of a case that outlasted every detective who worked it. That outlasted the generation of officers who inherited it. That outlasted the parents who waited their entire lives for an answer and died before it came. It is the story of a sister who never stopped calling. Of clothing stored in an evidence room for 6 decades. Of DNA so old and degraded that the scientists who worked with it said it was among the oldest biological material they had ever attempted to process. And it is the story of a man, a truck driver, a Korean War veteran, a husband and a father, who drove those Elmira roads every single day carrying a secret that the city around him never suspected. In this video, we are going to walk through every layer of this case. The night Mary Teresa disappeared and what the search found 4 days later. The autopsy detail that tells you everything about what was done to her. 61 years of dead ends and a file that never closed. The forensic breakthrough that nobody believed was possible with evidence that old. The name the DNA finally produced. The fact about that man's history that the police already knew. And the detail that his obituary and Mary Teresa's case share, a detail so precise, so haunting, that it is hard to believe it is a coincidence. Watch until the very end. Because the last thing we tell you about Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. is the thing that will stay with you longest. Subscribe right now and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And click the link in the description to join our community. Elmira, New York. March 1964. A mid-sized working city of about 40,000 people built along the Chemung River in upstate New York. Neighborhoods of wood frame houses spreading outward from a modest downtown core. A place where people knew each other. Where children walked to school alone, walked to friends' houses alone, walked home alone without anyone thinking twice about it. This was 1964. This was a city where that felt safe. Mary Teresa Simpson was 12 years old. The youngest of 4 children born to Ellsworth and Rose Simpson. The past year had been hard for her in ways that most 12-year-olds never have to navigate. Her parents had separated. The family had split between 2 homes. Mary Teresa had been living with her father in Hammondsport, a small town outside of Elmira, away from the city where she had grown up, away from her mother, away from her older sister Linda. 2 weeks before she was killed, Ellsworth brought Mary Teresa back to Elmira. 2 weeks. That was all the time she had in the city before that Sunday evening. Her sister Linda was 16. 4 years older, and they had been apart for almost a year. The move back to Elmira had started to close that distance again. Mary Teresa was home. She was back on the streets she had grown up on. She was back near her mother. Sunday, March 15, 1964. Mary Teresa left her father's apartment around 3 in the afternoon. She told Ellsworth she was going to visit her cousin. Instead, she went to see her mother. The visit was unannounced. Rose opened the door and found her youngest daughter standing there, and she was happy. They spent the afternoon together, the two of them catching up after months of limited contact, the kind of ordinary afternoon that families don't know to hold on to until it's already gone. Around 6:30 that evening, Mary Teresa left her mother's home. She was heading back to her father's apartment on foot, alone. The walk was short. A familiar route through residential streets she had known since childhood. She never arrived. March in upstate New York means short days. By 6:30, the light was already fading from the sky. The sidewalks on the east side of Elmira were mostly empty at that hour, families already inside, dinner already on tables. The streets were quiet. Mary Teresa was 12 years old, walking alone through those quiet streets, in the last gray light of a Sunday evening. Somewhere along that walk, she encountered someone. Or someone encountered her. Ellsworth waited. The evening passed. The apartment stayed quiet. He started making calls to Rose, to relatives, to everyone he could think of who might know where his daughter was. Nobody had seen Mary Teresa after she left her mother's door. Nobody remembered seeing a 12-year-old girl walking on those streets that evening. Ellsworth called the Elmira Police Department. Mary Teresa was officially reported missing that night. For 4 days, police and volunteers searched for her. Officers knocked on every door between her mother's home and her father's apartment. They checked basements and garages. They stopped anyone who had been outside that Sunday evening and asked what they had seen. Volunteers spread out along both banks of the Chemung River, into the parks, the empty lots, the wooded areas on the outskirts of the city. Search parties walked the logging roads and hillside trails that surrounded Elmira on its southern and western edges. The terrain was hilly. Heavily forested. Patches of snow and ice still on the ground from the winter. Ellsworth waited at home for the phone to ring. Rose waited. Linda, 16 years old, waited alongside them. On the fourth day, a man hiking with his 2 young sons on a wooded hillside off Coombs Hill Road, roughly 5 miles southwest of downtown Elmira, found her. And this is where things take a dark turn. Mary Teresa Simpson's body had been concealed. Not simply left. Concealed. Heavy stones piled on top of her. Tree branches layered over those. Leaves and earth packed down over everything. The weight of the stones alone told investigators something important. This had taken time. Significant time. The person who put her there had not panicked and run. They had stayed at that hillside, moving rocks, stacking branches, covering every trace, until they were satisfied that no one would find her easily. But there is one detail from that scene, one detail from the autopsy, that the original reporting barely paused on, and that I need you to understand fully before we go any further. Her mouth had been stuffed with soil and twigs. Not accidentally. Not incidentally. Someone had taken the dirt and vegetation of that hillside and packed it into a 12-year-old girl's mouth after she was already dead. The autopsy confirmed sexual assault. The cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. She had been taken off the street, driven out of the city, assaulted, strangled, and then, after all of that, someone had done one more deliberate thing to her body before walking away. That detail tells you something about the mind behind this crime. Something that will matter when we get to the man the DNA finally named. The Elmira Police Department shifted immediately from a missing person operation to a full-scale homicide investigation. Detectives interviewed every person who had been in the area on the evening of March 15, men who lived along the roads leading to the hillside. Men who had been seen driving in the area that Sunday. Men with prior arrests involving children. They pulled criminal files at the local, state, and federal level, every known offender in the region, cross-referenced against the timeline. Tips came in from across Chemung County. Each one was logged. Each one was investigated. Each one was either pursued further or eliminated. By October of 1964, 7 months after the murder, detectives had questioned more than 300 people in connection with the case. 300 people. None of those interviews produced a viable suspect. Not one meaningful lead emerged from 300 conversations. The file grew thicker. The trail grew colder. The local radio station and the Star-Gazette newspaper raised a $1,000 reward for information leading to the killer's identification. The community contributed to the fund. People who had never met Mary Teresa donated money because her murder had shaken Elmira in a way nothing else had in recent memory. By 1972, the reward had grown to $5,000. In 6 decades, nobody ever collected it. The case generated thousands of pages of documentation. Interviews, tips, leads, all logged, all filed, all filling entire cabinets in the department's records room. As years passed and detectives retired or transferred, new officers inherited the file. They read through the stacks of reports, searching for a connection that previous investigators had missed. Every review reached the same conclusion. Every actionable lead had dried up decades ago. 61 years of institutional memory passed from one generation of officers to the next. The file had outlasted them all. And the man who killed Mary Teresa Simpson was never a subject of any of those conversations. Not once. His name did not appear anywhere in the file. 300 people questioned. Thousands of pages of documentation. And somehow, in all of it, the name Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. never surfaced. If this story is already under your skin, you're not alone. Subscribe so you never miss a case like this one. Join our community through the link in the description box below. The person who carried the weight of this case the longest was not a detective. It was Linda. Linda Simpson was 16 years old in March of 1964. She had just gotten her younger sister back. Mary Teresa had only been home in Elmira for 2 weeks after the move from Hammondsport. 2 weeks of being in the same city again. And then she was gone. Linda watched the investigation unfold and then stall. She watched the detectives work the case for months and come up with nothing. She watched the local newspapers stop covering it. She watched the reward money sit uncollected year after year. She watched her parents age under the weight of an unanswered question. Ellsworth died first. Rose died later. Neither of them lived long enough to hear the name of the man who had taken their youngest daughter off that street. Neither of them ever knew. But Linda did not stop. Through every year that followed, through her own life being built and lived, through decades of silence from the police department, Linda called. Sometimes once a year. Sometimes more. She picked up the phone and called the Elmira Police Department and asked whether there was anything new. The answer was always the same. Nothing new. She called anyway. Every time. For decades. Linda later said, "It affected me really badly. I lived through it for years and cried and suffered heartache all this time. Like I told everybody, I did this for my mom." She had watched her mother go to her grave without an answer. And she had kept calling anyway. Not for herself. For Rose. That is the kind of love that doesn't know how to stop. In the year 2000, 36 years after the murder, Mary Teresa's clothing was submitted to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center for analysis. The items had been collected at autopsy in 1964 and stored in evidence for more than 3 decades. In 1964, the science to read what was on that clothing did not exist. By 2000, it did. Analysts examined the blouse. They found biological material. From it, they built a male DNA profile clear enough to use for comparison if a suspect could ever be identified. They entered the profile into CODIS, the FBI's national database of genetic material from convicted offenders across the country. No match. The unknown male was not in the system. Had never been convicted of a qualifying offense that would have required a DNA sample. The database came back empty. In 2003, additional clothing was submitted, the skirt and underwear, and analysts recovered more biological material from both. The additional samples confirmed and strengthened the original profile. The DNA was real. It was clear. It was specific to one person on Earth. But without a hit in CODIS or any other law enforcement database, it was still nameless. And then the detail that makes all of this worse. The man who left that DNA on Mary Teresa's clothing in 1964 died 1 year after the 2003 testing. He was buried in an Elmira cemetery less than 5 miles from the wooded hillside where he had left her body 4 decades earlier. His DNA was never collected at any point during his lifetime. He had never been a suspect. Nobody had any reason to ask for it. The science existed. The profile existed. He was still alive when both of those things were true. And still, nobody connected his name to that hillside. In 2022, the Elmira Police Department applied for and received a grant through Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that funds advanced forensic testing in cold cases that have exhausted traditional investigative options. The grant covered the full cost of submitting the DNA evidence to a private laboratory capable of working with samples that were nearly 60 years old. The evidence went to Othram, a private forensic genetics laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in extracting usable genetic profiles from severely degraded biological material. The samples from Mary Teresa's clothing were among the oldest material Othram had ever worked with. The scientists applied a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, a method that pulls every fragment of remaining genetic information from material that standard techniques can no longer read. From 60-year-old biological evidence, stored under varying conditions since 1964, Othram built a full and usable genetic profile of the unknown male. Then the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team uploaded that profile to public ancestry databases where millions of Americans have voluntarily submitted their DNA to find relatives and trace family lines. None of those people knew they might be helping to identify a killer. In 2023, investigators partnered with the Criminal Investigation Resource Center at Russell Sage College in New York, where Dr. Christina Lane, a criminologist and associate professor, and her students joined the genealogical research. They traced family lines, cross-referenced public records with genetic data, worked through birth records from the early 20th century, incomplete records, gaps in marriage documents, branches where individuals had moved, changed names, or left no paper trail at all. The work was slow, painstaking. The family tree stretched back generations into upstate New York. Some relatives had been born before 1900. Every branch had to be followed. Every dead end documented. Every surviving descendant identified and narrowed against gender, age, and geography. It took more than 2 years. By 2025, the tree had narrowed to a single individual. The man had lived in Elmira in 1964. He was 32 years old at the time of the murder. He was a truck driver. A Korean War veteran. Married with children. He had spent his entire life in the same city where the crime took place. He had been dead since March of 2004. Investigators contacted his surviving son and requested a voluntary DNA sample. The son agreed. The comparison confirmed a parent-child genetic relationship between the son and the unknown male whose DNA had been found on Mary Teresa's clothing. A familial match points to a family line, not to a specific individual within it. Investigators needed more. They obtained authorization to exhume the suspect's body from the Elmira cemetery where he had been buried for more than 20 years. The remains were carefully recovered, documented, and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory. DNA extracted directly from those exhumed remains was compared against the profile recovered from Mary Teresa's clothing in 2000 and confirmed in 2003. The match was definitive. The odds of selecting an unrelated individual who would produce the same profile, less than 1 in 320 billion. After 61 years, the unknown male had a name. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr., born 1931. Elmira, New York. He never left. He served in the United States Army during the Korean War and came home to Elmira to marry a woman named Rosemary. They had 4 children, Charlotte, Louis, Becky, and a son named Alfred III, who died in 1979. Murray spent his adult life working as a truck driver. He knew the roads in and around Elmira the way only a driver knows them: every back road, every logging trail, every stretch of hillside outside the city limits. He knew Coombs Hill Road. He knew the wooded hillside above the town. And here is the detail I told you to wait for. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. was known to local police for past behavior involving children. The Elmira Police Department had records on him going back years before the murder of Mary Teresa Simpson. before 1964. And yet, when detectives spent 7 months questioning more than 300 people in connection with the murder of a 12-year-old girl who had been sexually assaulted, his name never crossed anyone's desk. He was never interviewed. He was never fingerprinted in connection with the case. He simply did not appear. How that is possible, how a man with a documented history of predatory behavior toward children was never placed in the interview room in 1964, is a question the records alone cannot answer. And now, with 61 years between that investigation and today, it never will be answered. What happened next shocked everyone. Murray was never questioned. Never suspected. Never connected to the hillside or the girl. He drove the same Elmira roads for another 40 years. He went to family gatherings. He attended community events. He watched his surviving children raise grandchildren. From the outside, his life looked exactly like the life of any other Elmira man of his generation. Nobody in Elmira ever connected his name to what had happened on that hillside on a March evening in 1964. Not in 40 years. We are almost at the end of this story, and what comes next is the detail that stopped investigators cold. Subscribe now and join our community through the link in the description so you never miss a story like this one. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. died on March 16, 2004. He was 73 years old. His obituary was published in the Star-Gazette, the same Elmira newspaper that had raised reward money for information about Mary Teresa Simpson's murder 40 years earlier. The obituary ran on March 19, 2004. Slow down for a moment. Let that date settle. March 19, 2004. March 19, 1964 was the day Mary Teresa Simpson's body was found on Coons Hill Road. Exactly 40 years to the day between her discovery on that hillside and the publication of his obituary in the city newspaper. His obituary listed his wife Rosemary, his surviving children, his grandchildren, his military service. It described a man who had lived his whole life in one city, served his country, and raised a family. It did not mention Mary Teresa Simpson. At the time of his death, the two names had never been connected. He died as Alfred Murray, husband, father, veteran, and was buried in an Elmira cemetery less than 5 miles from the hillside where he had left a 12-year-old girl under rocks and branches 4 decades before. He took it with him. Or so he must have believed. February 10, 2026. The Elmira Police Department, the Chemung County District Attorney's Office, and the FBI held a joint press conference. Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood at the podium. She addressed the room and the assembled media. And she said the words that 61 years of investigation had been building toward. This is a historic day for the Elmira Police Department. Justice after almost 62 years. Thorne said that if Murray were still alive, the district attorney's office would seek criminal charges against him for murder. Linda was in the room. She was in her 70s now. A grandmother herself. She had spent 61 years carrying the weight of her sister's murder, calling the police department, waiting for the answer, watching her parents die without it, and still calling anyway. She said, "I am very happy it's finally ended. I just wish my mom was here." That is the sentence that every family in every cold case carries. The answer came, but it came late. It came too late for Rose. Too late for Ellsworth. The people who needed it most were not in the room to hear the name said out loud. Chief Thorne also said, "I hope the family members here know this case was never forgotten. Mary Teresa was never forgotten." 61 years. New York State's oldest cold case. The entire history of forensic DNA science, from its first criminal application in 1986 to forensic-grade genome sequencing in 2022, compressed into a single case file that had been open since the year of the British invasion and the Civil Rights Act. A 12-year-old girl. A pile of rocks on a hillside. A name that took 61 years to surface. The Mary Teresa Simpson case is not simply a story about a cold case solved. It is a story about time, about what 61 years of silence does to a family, about what a sister's refusal to stop calling can eventually produce, about what happens when science finally catches up to evidence that has been waiting in a box since the year Lyndon Johnson was president. It is a story about what forensic-grade genome sequencing means for every cold case file sitting in every evidence room in America with biological material that no one believes can still be read. Othram proved that 60-year-old degraded evidence can still produce a definitive profile. That changes everything for families like Mary Teresa's. But it is also a story about a failure. A specific, documented, inexplicable failure that no amount of forensic science can retroactively fix. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. had a history with local police that involved children before Mary Teresa Simpson was killed. That history existed in the department's own records. And in 7 months of questioning more than 300 people in connection with the murder of a 12-year-old girl who had been sexually assaulted, nobody pulled his name. That question has no answer now. Murray is dead. The detectives who worked the case in 1964 are gone. The institutional knowledge of what happened in that investigation, who was considered, who was skipped, and why went with them. What we are left with is this: a 12-year-old girl walked out of her mother's apartment on a Sunday evening in March of 1964 and encountered a man with a vehicle and a history that should have made him visible to the investigation that followed. He remained invisible for 61 years. He drove the same roads. He died in the same city. He was buried 5 miles from where he left her. And his obituary ran in the Elmira newspaper on the exact date, 40 years later, that her body had been found. Linda called the Elmira Police Department for 61 years and the answer was always the same. Until it wasn't. She said she did it for her mom. For Rose, who died without hearing the name. For a mother who spent decades waiting for a phone call that never came while she was still alive to receive it. The name came eventually. 61 years late. But it came. Mary Teresa Simpson was 12 years old. She had been back in Elmira for 2 weeks. She had spent a Sunday afternoon with her mother catching up after months apart. She left at 6:30 in the evening to walk home through streets she had known since childhood. She never arrived. But 61 years later, in a room in Elmira with her sister sitting in the front row, someone finally stood at a podium and said the name of the man who took her off that street. It took 61 years. But Mary Teresa was never forgotten. Thank you for staying with Mary Teresa's story all the way to the end. If this case meant something to you, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Like this video so more people can find it. Join our community, the link is in the description box below. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? See you in the next one.